Cult of the Lamb is interesting because of its fixation on blending. Often developers attempt to focus on a single genre and build the best version of their vision within the strengths and limitations of that selection. I'm no game developer, but it seems apparent to me that often the choice in genre is what informs the rest of the game, at least in terms of its mechanics. The genre selection comes to define the game, as it acts like a guiding principle throughout development. I mean, it's so common to hear about incredible ideas that development teams had for a title during conceptualization, but they ultimately had to scrap them because it didn't fit within the confines of the game they were attempting to build. The trimming of excess is what allows games to be focused, as they attempt to do one thing really well, while supplementing it with story, presentation, and other minor side activities. There are obvious exceptions to this, but more often than not, this seems to be the route most games traverse through development. This is doubly true in the world of indie games, where studios, and sometimes individual creators, don't have millions of dollars to fuel their creation. It's hard enough to build a great game with less money and a smaller team, and trying to get too ambitious can see the collapse of a project. And that's why Cult of the Lamb stands out as much as it does, because it forgoes the trappings of a single genre while still being a quality title. Blending. That's what Cult of the Lamb is all about. In gameplay, it blends dungeon crawling roguelike elements of games like The Binding of Isaac with management systems found in titles like Animal Crossing or Spiritfarer. In presentation, it blends a cutesy hand-drawn art style with satanic symbols and horrifying creature design. And in story, it tells its own tale while also ensuring the player can create their own stories through interactions with their villagers. Oh, and if your villagers start acting up too much, well, you can blend them too, into mush and meat. While this theme of blurring the lines is felt most in the gameplay, it's undeniable how much the development studio, Massive Monster, took it to heart while crafting this title. Dungeon crawling combined with village management. It's one of those things that seems so obvious now that we have it, but boy did the team do a good job of building a hybrid between the two. The premise in Cult of the Lamb is that you are a sacrificial lamb, who is saved by a trapped deity. In return, you serve the demonic being by slaying the 4 other gods who keep him locked up. To do this, you'll have to harness the strength to take them on by unlocking more powerful weapons. And to do that, you'll have to extract faith points from your loyal cult members. But they're only going to give you what you need if they're kept happy with food, faith, rituals, shelters, and a cleanly place to live. However, that's only going to manifest if you venture out into the dungeons to collect the necessary resources to keep your camp going. Yeah, hopefully you are starting to see the main allure of the gameplay by now. The way each component feeds off of one another to create an engaging gameplay loop that will continuously make you want to play just one more in-game day. What you do in the procedurally generated dungeons directly impacts what you're capable of doing back at camp, while simultaneously, the decisions you make to support your villagers will affect how powerful you can grow within the dungeons. These two components feed off each other without dipping into cannibalization. One side never overpowers the other because of the checks and balances placed on each of these two very different modes of play. Sure, a player might enjoy one style of play over the other and choose to spend more time with it, but the other component can never be fully ignored if progression is to take place. In other words, if you love the dungeon crawling, you can stick with that, but not completely. And if you love the management sim features, you can stick with that, but not completely. What I'm attempting to say is that the game allows for a lot of player freedom and decision making while not undermining the dungeon crawling or the management systems. Reading through Game Rant's interview with two of the developers reveals how important this balancing act was to the team, and how it ultimately proved to be their biggest challenge while crafting the title. But it's safe to say that they succeeded in walking this tightrope. That hard to put down feeling persisted throughout the entire experience for me, despite the fact that I switched my emphasis between the dungeons and my village multiple times throughout the experience. Although it may seem counterintuitive to do so, it's important to break down the two distinct modes of play individually, but keep in mind that their interconnectivity is what truly defines the gameplay. How they interact with one another is what really makes this game what it is. Anyway, the dungeon crawling systems are most directly comparable to The Binding of Isaac, a game Massive Monster noted as inspiration throughout interviews. The similarities are striking, but also very, very welcome. You'll travel through a series of procedurally generated rooms, defeating all sorts of enemies, collecting buffs, weapons, and curses, while attempting to reach the end without dying. The end of one gauntlet will lead to another, where you'll repeat the process until you die or defeat the final boss of that area. It's very akin to Isaac. The difference here is how this foundation has been built on. Because management is the other key portion of this game, you'll find countless resources on each run that feed back into your village economy. This includes finding things like grass, stone, wood, and coin, but perhaps the most important resource is the villagers themselves. While it's certainly possible to build your own stories around each villager, it's also completely possible to view them coldly and mechanically, as resources that fuel your end goal. In fact, the game even encourages this. But anyway, you'll often find these villagers trapped within specific rooms of the dungeon, and they're in need of rescue. Saving them transports them back to your village, where they await indoctrination and direction from you. Once they get back, you can assign them a name, you can change how they look, and then you can send them off to do a task. Also relating to resource management is how often the dungeons have branching paths where the player must choose how to progress. For instance, the first level will always be a combat-centric one, but upon completion, you'll have the option between 3 or 4 pathways, each containing different sorts of levels. Most are simply more combat rooms, but some may be tarot card rooms, where you can pick up new buffs to empower your run, while others might be resource rooms, where you can pick up some free wood, stone, coin, health, food, etc. Meanwhile, others are single combat rooms that reward the player with a new villager. The beginning and end points of each run are always the same, but what happens in between is on the player's shoulders. The choice of where to go is up to you, which helps promote that idea of player freedom within something as randomized as a roguelike, and that's impressive. Finally, the last component that helps distinguish Cult of the Lamb from The Binding of Isaac is how often storytelling elements are weaved directly into the dungeon crawling. Sometimes you'll enter rooms without enemies and without resources, as instead the emphasis is on expanding the lore of the world. This includes meeting new NPCs and opening up nearby shops where you can trade resources, as well as some mini-games such as the strangely addictive but simple Knucklebones, or it just might be a chance to go fishing. Conversely, some rooms will see visitations from those other elder gods that you're attempting to slay. Sometimes they'll just lecture you for a bit, while other times they will tamper with your village by poisoning members or turning them against you. It's another neat way of tying this all back in to the other mode of play. Now, focusing in on the combat itself, and honestly, it's not a whole lot to write home about. You have a few basic actions, such as a dodge roll, a melee swing, and a specials attack that has some extra utility, whether it's a ranged attack, an AoE, or a poisoning effect. The variety in each run comes from which melee weapon and special, called curses, you receive, along with the tarot cards that you find. The tarot cards add modifiers like extra health, more ammo for your special attacks, increased movement speed, and a few quirky ones like dropping a bomb each time you roll. These three factors are what will define your damage potential in each run. Together, they create just enough diversity to keep things interesting, but on their own, nothing stands out too drastically. The melee weapons are limited in selection, there's a handful of overpowered curses along with some duds, and the tarot cards have a lot of generic options. You won't end up with any crazy builds like you might in Isaac, unfortunately. Overall, the combat itself is passable, but certainly not the game's greatest strength. The joy in the dungeons comes mostly from story progression and resource collection, while combat is more of a vehicle to accomplish these goals. It is worth noting that there was a pretty significant difficulty spike when entering the third main dungeon. Perhaps I just had some bad RNG, but truly, the third main boss feels like the most difficult, despite the fact that there's two more to come after him. And that difficulty spike is of note because it felt particularly jarring in a game that's appeal is in how the moment-to-moment gameplay leads to a feeling of progression. Every second feels meaningful, and when you have something as difficult as this, it's like, oh, that doesn't blend in with everything else that's going on here. But anyway, turning our focus back to the village reveals an entire set of management systems for players to get lost in as they build their own relationships and continuously improve the conditions and efficiency of the cult. Those resources you harvested while out in the dungeons are put to use here. Wood and stone are used to construct buildings with specific purposes, such as farms or burial grounds. Plants, meats, and seeds are cooked up for food. And villagers are used to complete tasks while also granting you points towards leveling up your weaponry as well as unlocking new perks within the village. Like I mentioned earlier, when you get a new villager, you can really customize them, but you can also choose what they're to do. You can make them chop wood, you can make them gather stone, you can make them tend the farms, or they can just simply spend time worshipping you. Really, the main focus is to keep the villagers content so that you can extract everything you need from them. This includes feeding them cooked meals, building homes for them to sleep in, and bathrooms to relieve themselves in. You know, the necessities. But it doesn't stop there. You'll also want to account for the villagers' faith level in your leadership. This is a cult after all. Many of the title's non-traditional management systems come into play when examining the faith stat. Keeping this stat high requires interacting and encouraging with your members, delivering impactful sermons, harmonizing them through unifying doctrines, and conducting rituals that appease them. Interacting with members is nothing new for this style of game, so I won't harp much on that. Instead, I want to focus in on what you do within the confines of your church. Daily sermons are used to extract faith points from your followers, and after filling the bar, you can select a new perk for dungeon crawling. This includes things like stronger weapons and more curses for you to experiment with. They are vital to unlock because you're gonna need those more powerful weapons as you reach tougher dungeons. Meanwhile, doctrines act as guiding principles for your villagers to follow. These are blanket perks that apply to every member and can make your life a lot easier. For example, I selected a perk that negated any negative consequences from a villager consuming a meal made of grass. Grass is such an easy to find resource that making meals out of it without consequence meant my farm system wasn't taxed as heavily. So I got it, and I loved it. These doctrines also go a long way in defining the tone of your cult. If you want something more peaceful and relaxing like Animal Crossing, you're welcome to choose the perks that benefit the well-being of your members. However, you can go full crazy and view the villagers as resources to be extracted and nothing more. An example of this would be either gaining faith points when a member is sacrificed versus not losing as much faith when a follower dies of natural causes. If you plan on harvesting your people often, the first perk is appealing. But if you focus on prosperity, the second is much more alluring. The choice and the freedom is up to you. Finally, rituals follow a similar ideology. Some are about extracting resources from your followers at the cost of faith points, while others will boost the overall faith stat. These basically serve as auto win buttons a lot of the time, as they can easily turn around a plummeting faith or hunger stat, making them a bit overpowered. However, it was probably a necessary concession, given one of the game's biggest allures is getting into that flow state, where everything just keeps going without interruption. And if you have some big plummet that ruins everything, that might ruin the flow. At the same time, conditions in your camp can change drastically if you choose to do a few gauntlet runs in a row without stopping back. So yeah, these were kind of necessary. But anyway, these occult abilities go a long way in determining the stability of your camp as well as how well you perform in the field. It should also be noted that there's a fair bit of customization to engage with within your camp. There's a myriad of different decorations you can build, along with pathways like dirt and stone flooring to really make your base your own. Many of these are also unlocked from treasure boxes found in the dungeons, resulting in yet another method of interconnectivity between the two modes. Now, me personally, I'm not a big fan of customizing my camp in these management games. I'm more interested in the mechanical side of it and the efficiency side of it. So the customization doesn't appeal much to me. However, for others, it's going to be an integral and enjoyable inclusion, so I'm glad they included it. For me personally, there was enough mechanical systems underneath the customization to keep me hooked on the development of my camp. Now, this interest did fade as I neared the end of the story and shifted my focus on defeating the final boss. And I think that's important to note because it's very apparent to me that you're not supposed to play Cult of the Lamb in the same way you would a game like Animal Crossing, despite the surface level but apt comparisons. There's no sort of daily random activities that make each day feel different, resulting in the experience within your camp stagnating towards the end. And you know what? That's absolutely fine. My point here is that the game did a good job of knowing how long it could hold the player's interest with the systems it employed and designed their game appropriately around that. It's a well-paced, fun, and engaging experience. And sure, those are a bunch of buzzwords, but honestly, they're very true in describing Cult of the Lamb. Alright, before we wrap things up, I want to do a quick hit on the presentation and the story. So let's see, yeah, it's not hard to praise the magnificent art direction that the game utilizes. Including cute little farm animals was a smart choice, as the sheer adorableness of the character design offsets much of the eerie vibes invoked by the occult symbolism. These two polar opposites end up working well together as a result. The art style really ties everything together in a very necessary way, considering how the game attempts to be two genres in one. It's a credit to the designer's artistic vision, it just looks immediately inviting and welcoming. Still, a few issues can be found. This includes notable amounts of oversaturation at times, which can result in the game looking like it has a cheap filter over the top of it, akin to some of the thumbnails that I make. On top of that, some environmental objects can hide your viewpoint of some enemies, which is frustrating. It never feels good to take damage when it feels like you couldn't see it coming. This, paired with occasional lag spikes, made for some uncomfortable runs where it felt like the game was actively working against me. Luckily, it's nothing game-breaking, but they're notable enough issues that could be cleaned up in patches, and hopefully they are soon. In terms of sound work, I did quite enjoy the soundtrack, even if it does play things pretty safe. Notably, the alert sounds for keeping the player informed using audio were also well done. In particular, with so much going on in some of these dungeon runs, it was nice to include an audio cue alerting you to when you received a tick of damage. So yeah, that was nice. Besides that, really no issues to report within the sound work. And finally, there isn't much of note to say about the story in this game. It takes a relatively simple approach by creating a narrative framework goal for you to push towards, while mostly allowing you to create your own stories within your village and the confines of that story. The brief outline I mentioned at the beginning of this video about how you're a sacrificial lamb and you're trying to save this god, and to do so you have to defeat the other gods, yeah, that's really about it. It's a serviceable story, but a little bit predictable to be quite honest. Still, it fits into the style of game quite well, so no complaints overall once again. So what we have here is another solid indie title. 2022 sure has had a lot of them so far. Cult of the Lamb gives you a taste of multiple genres blended together in smart ways that keeps the engagement factor high. It won't keep you hooked endlessly like other dungeon crawlers or management sims, but that's okay, as the roughly 15-hour campaign provides plenty of joy and satisfaction. It's all tied together by the stories you create in your village and an inviting hand-drawn art style. I heavily recommend checking this one out, as it scratched an itch that I didn't even know I had. I look forward to seeing how future games are inspired by Cult of the Lamb and other titles like it, as they attempt to blend multiple genres into new experiences. Thanks for watching. Well, that brings us to the end of another video. I wanted to take a moment to update y'all on future videos. I'm currently working on a campaign playthrough of Temtem, trying to really learn the ins and outs of the game so that I can deliver a proper assessment of it, and that should probably be the next video. In terms of the rest of the year, I want to review Plague Tale Requiem, Gotham Knights, God of War Ragnarok, and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet for sure. Some other games on my radar include High on Life, Sonic Frontiers, and that new Tales of the Borderlands game. What I'm able to get to, only time will tell, and some of those reviews I promised, well, they might bleed into 2023, but they should be coming with time. Anyway, yeah, that's what to expect. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content. We're only a few subs away from 1,000, and it's been very painful lately because it's been very stagnant. I've been stuck between 982 and 986 for like 6 weeks now without much growth, so if we could just close that last 15, that would be amazing. But anyway, yeah, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, and join our Discord, the link is below, and as always guys, have a nice day, and take care.